Hey, now welcome to the show, where the wind's blowing strong and the truth can flow. This is the good oil. Catch a vibe today with Cam Slater leading us all the way.
Chris Trotter, welcome to the Good Oil podcast.
I'm very pleased to be here, Cam.
I'm very pleased you are. I've been following you since I was a young fella working in the National Bank in Wellington, and I'd every morning get my newspaper, and every evening at lunchtime I'd go and get the Evening Post. And the first thing I would turn to was the centre section, which is where your column always was, and I'd read what Chris Trotter had to say.
That seems a very long time ago now, Cam.
Well,
yes, I was thrilled to get that column from Richard Long, who was the editor of the Dominion, as it was then. He heard me on national radio talking to Brian Edwards,
dear old Brian,
who was standing in for Kim Hill on that particular morning. And of course, Brian Edwards had been on the Ralston group. And so had I. And he was waxing eloquent about the Ralston group, and he mentioned the fact that they paid us, didn't they? And I said, yes, they did. He said, I never picked mine up. It was some negligible amount. And I said, well, $200 or whatever it was may have been a negligible amount for you, Brian, but I was very pleased to get it. And who should be listening but Richard Long? And shortly afterwards, the guy who edited the student newspaper Critic the year before I did, Simon Kilroy, who was in the press gallery for the Dominion at that time, I got a call from him. He said, Richard was listening to you this morning on the radio. He was wondering if you'd like a column. And I said to Simon, let me think about that for a nanosecond. Yes, I'd definitely like a column. And so that's how it began. And Richard invited me up to his editors' conference. I don't think it was his editor, it was INL's as it was, the editors' conference. And who should be there but Pat Booth?
Oh, yes.
And dear old Pat Booth, he did the rounds in a coffee break or at lunchtime. And I got another call from Simon Kilroy as I was heading up to Kim Hill's house in Brooklyn in the taxi. He said, how would you like to be syndicated? I said, just give me another nanosecond, Simon.
Let me think about that.
Yeah. And so I got syndicated. So it was lucky. It was ridiculously easy.
But Chris,
but it was tremendous fun, and it went on for, nearly 20 years or more, perhaps more.
But Chris, we're opposed politically, or some would say
we seem to be getting closer together.
I think we always have.
Rather unnerving.
Like I used to say to national politics, because Dad was the president of the party when I lived in Wellington, and he'd come down and stay at my place, and I'd go to meetings. I was even at the meeting where they decided to throw Winston out of the caucus because I was keeping the notes. I told Winston this. I was keeping the notes of the meeting. So I was going along. I got to see all of this stuff on the inside, And I'd say to them, have you read Chris Trotter's latest column? Oh, no, why would I read Chris's column? I said, because he's telling you what's happening inside the Labour Party. And that's when I realized, and I wasn't even writing at that stage. I wasn't even blogging. I was just a political animal in a political family. And that's when I realized that if you listen to the words of the people that oppose you, you can find out how they think. And when you find out how they think, you can find out how to defeat them.
Know your enemy.
Know your enemy.
The oldest rule in warfare.
Sun Tzu.
That's right.
And that's when I started reading you, and I've never stopped reading your articles. Every article comes out on your Substack or your Bow Alley Road blog or anywhere else. I read what Chris Trotter's got to say because I think you've got a finger on the political pulse of New Zealand from a particular angle, and probably 80% of what you say I agree with. And then probably another 10% we would have mild disagreement. And then after that, the other 10% doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Well, Cam, I've always thought you can measure your success in politics, particularly if you're writing about politics, by getting a new middle name, right? I mean, I was born Christopher Marshall Trotter.
Right.
Right, Marshall being my mother's family name. And over the years, particularly on the left, when I first started writing, people would say, have you read Chris Trotter's latest piece? Or even, have you read Chris's latest piece?
Yeah.
And they kind of dropped the Christian name. Have you read Trotter's piece?
Then it was Trotsky, wasn't it?
No. They never, Trotsky was actually an affectionate nickname on the left. Suppose then it was just like, have you read Trotter's piece? And then I got a new middle name. Have you read Chris fucking Trotter's piece? I bet you've got a new middle name too.
Yeah, I bet I have too. There's that Cameron fucking Slater. I can remember turning up to functions, a room with 40 or 50 National Party luminaries in it. I walk into the room, dead silence. I was like, oh, fuck. And I thought, I kind of like that. And I can remember Jason Eade ringing me up one day, prior to Dirty Politics and saying, oh, the boss isn't happy with you. And I said, oh, so what? And he said, well, you need to take that blog post down. It's unhelpful. I said, Jason, I'm not on your payroll. Despite what Nicky Hager liked to say, I was not on anybody's payroll. And what Nicky Hager never really understood is I did what I did for shits and giggles. And because I could.
And I suspect because deep down you believed in it, Cam.
Well, I don't believe in party politics anymore. And that's one lesson that I learned from that. Polarization of politics has caused a toxic cancer to exist within our body politic, where people like you and I were almost forbidden to talk to each other, or we'd be carded or written off because you're consorting with the enemy.
Yeah, that's
and remember we used to have those blog drinks up at the Galbraiths and everyone would come along. It was all very convivial. That was all, between 2005 and 2008. After 2008, it all changed. And that polarization, that nastiness came into New Zealand politics after Helen Clark lost. And it was there a little bit, but we kind of just shrugged it off. But after 2008, that polarization came in and all of a sudden the drinks stopped, people stopped going, and we weren't talking to each other anymore. And I think that's where that malaise came in. And I don't know what caused it. But this red team, blue team swapping around every 9 years kind of doesn't work for us as a nation.
No, I think you're right. I'm just thinking back to see whether I agree with your timeline. I think on the left, all the stuff that has been completely roiling New Zealand politics and making people step back aghast from some of the things that are going on and some of the positions that people hold. That all began on the left 40 or more years ago.
Because the left always used to call us Tories. Like, I used to sit there and talk to Matt McCart and he'd go, oh, you Tories, this and Tories. And I just scoff.
A very Labour Party thing. That I don't think ordinary New Zealanders ever used the term Tories. people in the Labour Party would call the National Party Tories. Some of them would. Most of them called them Nats, which is the New Zealand expression for the
Tories. It means nothing in New Zealand. It was
No.
meant as an insult, but it's not an insult if you don't think it is.
Well, nothing's an insult if you don't think it is.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, the turning point on the left came in the aftermath of the 1981 Springbok tour.
Right.
Now, that was an enormous effort, and the left was pretty much united in its opposition to apartheid. So it went all the way from, Communist Party of New Zealand, Socialist Unity Party, the Trotskyites and the Socialist Action League, all the way up to Labour.
Most people in New Zealand were opposed to apartheid, but we didn't like having our rugby. You're in the middle of it.
I think that's a fair comment. Yeah, it was really over whether or not that should stop people watching the Springboks versus the All Blacks. That's what I think it boiled down to.
The Springbok tour is where I became kind of immune to protest, and also gave me a lifelong dislike of John Minto. And he seemed like a very bitter man back then, and he's even more bitter now.
Well, I find it very hard to read his stuff now. I mean, John was always a hardliner. His politics were like his.
Well, it was never,
Just
but it was never
sharp
practical.
edged.
But it was never practical.
Oh, I don't know whether that's a question you should even raise with John. I mean, John took his stands, and to his credit,
Took the hits too.
yes, very much so. But I always admired John after apartheid fell, because he could have said, well, done and dusted.
We won.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he never did that. He kept on looking at South Africa and saying, wait a minute, this isn't what it was supposed to look like. You guys seem to have forgotten everything you used to say you stood for. And so,
But is
full credit to him for that.
that a euphemism for the white guilt liberal sort of left-wing outlook, and this is how you should be, and then when it doesn't end up that way, they're bitterly disappointed but do nothing about it?
Oh, no, the typical left thing is to go on pretending that everything's fine.
It's like saying,
No, you go and visit Stalinist Russia, you come back, I have seen the future, and it works. That's the typical
then you get
historical left-wing position.
you get someone like me who says, well, let's look at everything that's communist or even socialist and see, show me the successes. And the answer from the hardcore left-wing person is, oh, that's because Chavez didn't do it right. Or that's because Castro didn't do it right. And if we just give it one more go and we do it right,
Yeah.
we'll reach nirvana.
Then there's the sort of absolutely true communist, like Erich Honecker's wife, who was the Minister of Education in the German Democratic Republic.
Any country,
East Germany to us.
any country that's got democratic in
Their name, not. That's right. But she was interviewed, I think it's for an outfit called History Reclaimed, by a former Chilean ambassador, British ambassador to Chile, I should say. The other way around if it was Chilean ambassador, British ambassador to Chile, who really wanted to talk to her because Chile was one of the very few places, if not the only place, that agreed to take the people from the old East German regime when the wall fell and East Germany ceased to exist. Germany was reunified. She ended up living in Chile, and she was absolutely unrepentant. Nothing and this guy was a trained historian. I mean, he was very interested. He had been an exchange student to East Germany way back, and he thought it would be really interesting to talk to someone who had been in this kind of what we used to call actually existing socialism, or real existing socialism, which were the Eastern European countries, Soviet Union. He thought it would be interesting, and he was astonished because she was absolutely unfazed by everything that had happened. They had done nothing wrong. It was a workers' paradise. Everything was the result of the evil imperialists in the United States, the evil West Germans. Just absolutely hard line.
But the funny thing is, all of these countries, these Eastern European countries, they had to build walls around their country, not to keep people out, but to keep their own people in.
Well, yeah, certainly the German Democratic Republic did that. I don't think they were the only ones that had border fences, though.
No, they didn't. Yeah.
But certainly when those border fences opened, that was the beginning of the end. I think Hungary did it first, and then of course all the East Germans just went to Hungary and through the fence, and everything started collapsing. But to be fair, and looking back at that whole period, it couldn't have happened without Gorbachev.
No, that's right. And this is what people say when I say, people ask me about various things in modern times and saying, if we don't get rid of Helen Clark, then the next step is no elections. Or if we don't get rid of, John Key, then he'll cancel. Or if we don't, and you hear it all the time. And I sit there and I think, have you not studied history? Nothing lasts forever. The Roman Republic didn't last forever. The Roman Empire didn't last forever. The Ottoman Empire didn't last forever. Everything ends at the time it's supposed to end. The trouble with totalitarianism is that often you vote yourself into it, and then you have to shoot your way out of it.
Yeah. Or you shoot your way into it and in the Soviet Union's case, kind of vote your way out of it. But it's quite interesting. On the left, I never went much beyond the left of the Labour Party.
You flirted a little bit with New Labour, which would
was the left of the Labour. That was the left of the Labour Party, pretty much. It was amazing watching that party split. Huge numbers of people.
Yeah, you're on the inside of it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I remember the night that the Dunedin North Electorate Committee, which I'd sat on for years, lost all of its elected officials. All of them defected to the NLP. But that's a by the by.
But Labour got really hurt on both sides because, and this is what I love pointing.
Oh yeah,
this is what I love.
They lost the left, now they lost the right.
That's what I love pointing out to ACT Party people who think that they're all that in a bag of chips. Say, well, you're actually like part of the Labour Party. You're the right of the Labour Party. That's what you really are. That's how you
founded Douglas, Richard Prebble.
Yeah, exactly.
Michael Bassett.
Exactly. All luminaries of the right who were all in the Labour Party.
And there was a time, 70s, when Michael Bassett was regarded as on the left of the Labour Party, if you can believe that.
And now when you talk to him, like I've tried to raise with him a couple of things, and he again, he won't have a bar of it. I always raise the local body election reforms that he did, where he allowed, as the local government minister, allowed councils general competence. Most people don't know what that means, but councils prior to those Bassett reforms weren't really allowed to borrow any money. They had to live within their rate space. And then when the Labour government of the time gave councils general competence, that allowed them to go and borrow money. And of course, now we have eye-watering debt across almost every council.
Yeah, it's always a source of great wonder to me, as someone who spent 20 years living in Dunedin, to look around, this classic sort of late Victorian, early Edwardian city with its neo-Gothic architecture. Place looks like it stood there for 800 years, not 100. And think, this this was all done on the income that the city itself could raise. And it's an astonishing achievement. Mind you, you look all over the world, that great sort of heave out of mostly the British Isles, but other parts of Europe as well, Norway, Denmark, places like that. But you look at all these cities, I mean, not just Dunedin, but you look at places like Melbourne or Chicago. I mean, these cities just virtually rose out of the ground overnight.
Very short space of time.
Just amazing. Now, I suspect there was a bit of borrowed money, but of course, Dunedin was built on the gold rush, essentially. I mean, it had its own stock exchange. It was the biggest city in New Zealand for a while.
And the city was run by parsimonious Presbyterians.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Short arms and deep pockets.
But, it's astonishing when you see what that period of 100 roughly, or maybe a wee bit longer years was able to do. I mean, the Maori talk about their 700 or 800 years here.
But they didn't really advance at all, did they?
Well, they were a particular kind of society, and it was quite elaborate in terms of the sort of society that it was. And it had its strengths. I'm quite certain of that. But this country was bush in 1840.
Pretty much.
And with a bit of cultivation here and there, but mostly it was bush or it was wild, right? Some tracks through it to get the greenstone or to get the kaimoana, but it was a big empty country. And in the space of 100 years, people from the British Isles turned it in to an extraordinary society.
Extraordinary modern society.
Yeah.
And if you look at our history, I think some of the problems that we've got in New Zealand now, although they appear to be quite large, are not large enough to have ever caused a civil war in New Zealand.
Well, that's right.
And even if you look at the land wars and the musket wars, they were very small affairs. If you look at the numbers of troops that were involved in Ohiwai, for example, or Ruapekapeka, you're talking hundreds.
Yeah.
Oh, 100 on either side.
It's sort of like an Alp's Imperial Army paper sword fight.
You go to Ruapekapeka and you see where the camps were and everything, and you think, goodness, this was not that large. They had like 4 cannon or something like that,
I'll tell you a lovely story. A friend and I were at the Galbraith Ale House. And that was a meeting place for all sorts of people. And one of the people there was a professor, I think, at AUT. And she was from Turkey. Brain the size of the planet.
And as many letters in her name as well, probably.
Beren Yashkataya.
There you go, see?
It was. But she was listening to this conversation that my friend and I were having. And it was about Rangiofia, which was an engagement during the Waikato War. Right? And we were arguing whether 12 people had died or 17 people died. We're having this big argument. And Beren was sort of half listening. And she says, 17,000 would be quite a large number. And we looked at her. No. Just 17. And the withering look she gave us. I mean, coming from a part of the world that is just soaked in blood.
Yeah.
The idea, that we could be getting worked up about a battle that resulted in 17 or 12 casualties. It just took her breath away. It was like, You New Zealanders have no idea what the rest of the world is like.
History is important, and that's what I like about your writing. You're always going back to something in history. In fact, you're a lot like Winston Peters, really. Whenever you have a discussion with Winston Peters, he'll say, this happened, Eisenhower said this or whatever. You do the same thing. Hey, do you get as annoyed as I do at the revisionist history of New Zealand?
Oh, don't get me started.
Well, I'm going to get you started. Okay, because I sit there looking and I think, there's this modern view, wistful view that Maori had this perfect society where everyone lived with peace, love, and mung beans. And it was all good until the dreadful Pākehā arrived in New Zealand, and it's all been downhill since then. And I've written a couple of blog posts, facetiously mocking that, along the lines of the Monty Python sketch about what have the Romans ever done for us.
That's right.
But, if we look at, we're told now this heroic version of the Treaty of Waitangi that all of these iwi chiefs signed to not cede sovereignty to Queen Victoria. She wasn't the Empress of India at that stage, but she was well on her way to being the Empress of India, certainly the most powerful monarch in the world at the time. And it stretches credulity to think that's what the British envisaged, that the Queen of England was on a par, on the same level as the paramount chief of Ngāti Whātua, or the paramount chief of, whatever tribe there is.
Well, it is the most pernicious revisionism, because any kind of study of the actual events as recorded,
not just the document, the events
as recorded by people who were there at the time, and any study of the subsequent historically verifiable actions which followed the treaty signing at Waitangi and at other places around New Zealand,
Kaimarama,
knows beyond any dispute that sovereignty was ceded. Apirana Ngata wrote a whole, pamphlet, in the sense of pamphlets in the 1930s, which are like little booklets, right, about the treaty, in which he says it as plainly as that. And the idea that sovereignty was not debated, the idea that there was just this general understanding, this only applies to the Pākehā, it doesn't apply to us.
Well, it ignores history.
Well, yes, it most certainly does ignore the recorded and the recalled events of that period. And it forces those who accept this Waitangi Tribunal finding on the treaty. It forces all those people to treat the Maori leaders of the time as idiots.
Ignoramuses and idiots who didn't know what they were doing.
Simple children. Because only a simple child could possibly have signed the document that the Waitangi Tribunal claims was signed. I mean, Hobson arrived in a sailing ship with, as you point out, metal cannons. His men carried muskets. The sealers and the whalers who had preceded him brought with them muskets. The people at Waitangi, some of them had been to London.
Yeah, Hongi Hika, prior to the signing of the treaty, had marauded his way through the Bay of Plenty and south of Auckland collecting something like 8,000 slaves along the way and walked them back up to his, power base in Northland. And in 1832, the United Kingdom had abolished slavery.
Yeah.
And in 1840, we're signing a treaty saying that the chiefs can keep all their possessions, which included their slaves. It was an amazing document, but most of those
to remember, of course, in 1814 or 15, whenever it was, Christianity arrived.
Yes.
And Christianity had cut a swathe through Maoridom, because frankly, it was a better story, unless you were a chief.
But we're told now that modern, we see all of these Karakir, and we talk about the sky gods and Maui and all of this.
Yeah, there's all a recrudescence of traditional Maori belief systems. But in 1840, there were a great many Christian Maori
who had been attacked by Ngāpuhi.
Yeah.
And wanted protection.
And they had literacy. They could write, they could read. It wasn't the same New Zealand that James Cook had arrived in 1769. It was a very different New Zealand. And one of, and if you think about it, I mean, it's the nearest equivalent I can think is to put this into a science fiction context, right? A sort of Hollywood science fiction. So you've got aliens from another world, but they look like us.
Arriving here in ships.
Yeah. In
spaceships.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Although those B-2s are getting more and more like science fiction every day, but that's another argument. Yeah, that they arrive in these interplanetary craft, right? And they have ray guns. Now, what would we, good old Homo sapiens, what would we want first and foremost?
Well, we'd want those guns.
We would want those ray guns.
And if we had to take them off some aliens by overwhelming a few of them, then we build from there.
So what was the very first thing that the Maori saw in the hands of these? I mean, the very first encounter with Cook, some of his men opened fire, right? Must have been a hell of a shot.
Yeah, well,
then how do we get these?
Yeah, why are they holding those clubs like that?
Yeah.
And then the big puff of smoke, and then, Hone's fallen over.
Yeah, I don't think they were in any doubt for any length of time as to what exactly they were up against. But this to me, tells the story that Maori had been in contact with Europeans since, the late 18th century. They knew what the Europeans had
and could do.
They knew the things that they brought with them. I mean, after the muskets, I bet the first things they were after were axes, nails, hammers.
Pots would have been the first thing, because Maori didn't have pots.
So, I mean, didn't have metal.
No.
Metal is this extraordinary. If you've never had metal is magic.
Yeah.
Right? So, all of that is going on. And then Maori being an enterprising people, too enterprising for some of the colonists' liking, they went to sea, the equivalent of getting on the spaceship and flying to the other planet. Yeah. And I imagine if we got to another planet capable of sending people across the universe, we'd go, whoa.
Wow. So they've done all this on there in our country now. I think we'll make peace with these people.
Exactly. And if you hear that another kind of alien is sailing up the coast, you're thinking, well, if it's not these guys, it's going to be those guys. We know these guys. We can speak their language.
Yeah, they're not trying to kill us all.
Yeah.
those guys over there, we've heard things about them, the French especially, and we definitely don't want the Spanish here.
Yeah. So the idea that they were completely unaware of the power of Great Britain, the power, some of them had even met the king. I mean, and the other thing, which is hard for us to sort of get our heads around now, the musket wars had reduced the Maori population by something like 20%, which is about the same number of losses as the Soviet Union sustained in World War II, which is just unbelievable, and at 27 million or something, right? And yet, when they had gone to London, or to Paris or Vienna, they went all over the place, even to Sydney town, as it was called then. What would they have come away with? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of these people. You have no idea how many of them there are.
Yeah, they're building pars or buildings or storehouses that are many stories high. You know, even the Americans were coming down here, in the early 1800s or from the late end of the 17th.
Yeah.
But again, this whole premise that Maori didn't cede sovereignty to the British Empire, which had just defeated Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah.
Right? And we're just a few short years, we're going to be heading off to the Crimea to fight a battle there against the Russians. That was in the 1860s. And then you had, 1840s was here. They'd only defeated Napoleon a few years earlier than that.
Yeah.
Twice.
I'm not sure how far news of Waterloo travelled up the Waikato, but
no, but
yeah, I take your point.
The point is that the British Empire has just defeated the French Empire.
Yeah.
It's not a sign of
how it was known.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what Maori wanted a number of things. They wanted the Europeans because the Europeans brought all these things that they wanted.
And they could trade things for them and get more things.
And they brought knowledge and know-how and technology and things that Maori grabbed with both hands and were very soon turning to their own advantage and their own profit. But they knew how many of the Pākehā there were across the ocean. They knew that they could come here in their tall ships. And they knew that these islands were a prize, right? And so being left alone, being allowed to go on ruling as you had always ruled, that was less and less a realistic proposition. So they worked with Busby, right, across in New South Wales. They got themselves a flag. Busby sort of engineered their Declaration of Independence, but they understood that they were going to have to deal with the Pākehā. The Pākehā were not going to go away. There were vastly more of them than there were of Maori. Not at the moment. And this is the great argument, there were only 2,000, there were 100,000 Maori. Why would they have been frightened of the Pākehā? Well, probably for the same reason we'd be frightened of aliens if aliens arrived here in a spacecraft.
You've got overwhelming power.
With ray guns.
With ray guns. I mean, it just to segue to modern, what we're seeing in the news now, we've got a country that is 80 times larger in land size to its enemy, implacable enemy, has 10 times the population of its implacable enemy, that they've sworn to their population that that we will be wiping it off the face of the earth.
Members of the Iranian parliament sort of stand up and chant death to Israel, death to America.
Yeah, so they're sitting there
A bit of a giveaway.
saying that, they've got the sixth largest army on paper in the world. And there's these little upstart, these uppity little Jews, for want of a better term, who are making Iran kneel before them. They're flying around, Tehran in their planes with gay abandon. And the mullahs must be sitting there quaking, thinking, we can't touch them. Even our missiles that we've said are going to strike fear into the heart of Israel are being shot down again with gay abandon. Sure, some pieces of it come down and occasionally one gets through, but the deaths of Israelis from Iranian missiles are measured in tens, not in hundreds or thousands or millions if it was nuclear weapons involved. But if you've got a country that's willing to hurl missiles that far to prove a point, imagine what they would do if they had the bomb.
Well,
it's the same sort of dichotomy that you've got Maori, a much larger population of New Zealand, dealing with the British Empire, the Pākehā, the white flea, coming here and telling us what to do. I think we'll sign a peace treaty.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the essence of the historical event that took place at Waitangi was a cession of sovereignty so that New Zealand was under the protection of the British Crown.
All the people were subjects of the British Crown.
But it was more than that. And this is what makes it such an extraordinary document in terms of, the colonial history of the 19th century, is that it said, you cede the sovereignty of these islands to Queen Victoria. We will now treat you as the equal of British subjects anywhere else in the world. And you can go on running your affairs in the way you have always run them on your lands, and no one else can buy land from you except the Crown, and only if you wish to sell it. Now,
I'm not pretty generous.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that they signed that.
Yeah,
that's actually a pretty good deal. Now, the big argument, if there is an argument, is about what Tino Rangatiratanga means, right? And how far does it extend? And what did the British understand by Tino Rangatiratanga? Now, people can get all legalistic about treaties. What language were they written in? What language were the people to whom the treaty was presented speaking? But the essence of treaties is either two equal powers make an agreement,
or a very superior power,
or a very superior power, usually having proved their superiority in war,
like the Treaty of Versailles,
impose upon the defeated. Now, the Treaty of Waitangi was not that sort of treaty. It was a treaty not between equals, but a treaty written in such a way as the more powerful party pretended it was treating with equals, which was a generous, some would say noble thing to do.
Because if the British Army or the British Empire decided, we've had enough of this, we're going to sort it out, and sent 10,000 soldiers.
Which is exactly what they did.
They could send...
how many years later? Quarter of a century later or less, when things stopped working.
But that again was very
they sent
escalated.
12,000 troops under General Cameron.
Problem solved.
That was the end of that. Now, that was the end of the treaty as well. Let's not be silly. Jock Brookfield, who was a professor up at the University of Auckland, a law professor, back, I think, in the 90s or early 2000s, he wrote about the treaty, and he wrote about what happened in New Zealand. And he said what happened here really was what he called, I'm quoting him now, a revolutionary seizure of power. And it was a revolutionary seizure of power by the Pākehā colonists. And in that seizure, they effectively tore up the treaty. They said, it's ours now. Don't mess with us. Right? Because before then, it was Britain's. It was, oh, well, it was still Britain's, but it was ruled directly by a governor sent from London. And he had his own advisors, but executive authority in New Zealand lay with the governor. But in 1852, we got self-government and we got a parliament. And the moment we got ourselves a parliament, essentially the treaty was a dead letter.
And again, if you look at the history of the British Empire, particularly India, for example, it was a very small population of Europeans, ostensibly a company, the East India Company, that subjugated a subcontinent, ruled it viciously, and they did. And it was only when the Indian Mutiny happened that the British government stepped in and privatized the East India Company and said, no, we've had enough of this, and exerted their power over that company, that they then moved in considerable forces. There were already considerable forces, but the East India Company forces were nationalized. There was tens of thousands of British troops in India. Arthur Wellesley cut his teeth.
That's right.
In India.
That's right.
Before he went and took on Napoleon Bonaparte. He famously defeated 100,000 Maratha cavalry with 15,000 sepoys using British tactics. There was massed cavalry charges and tulwars flying around and lances on the Indian side, cut to pieces by cannon and musket fire. And that was prior to 1840.
Oh, yeah.
That Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was cutting his way through Western India.
Yep, that's true. I think Dalrymple has written a very good book called The Anarchy, which is all about the East India Company. I think, to be fair to the East India Company, they were very much a divide et impera, as you would expect from classically trained gentlemen, divide and rule. They would have battles with princes, which they usually won because they had
cannon,
superior technology. But then they would do deals with the princes they'd just defeated, like, well, you can go on ruling, but we get a cut, right?
Yeah, it's like Sultan Tipu was exactly that.
Yeah.
No, they defeated him in battle and said, okay, you can stay, right? But now we're going to tithe you.
Yeah, that's right. We'll get half the tax.
Yeah, half the taxes, whatever.
That's right.
You can still live in your palace. And then Arthur Wellesley came in and said, no, we've had enough of that.
And then you got the so-called mutiny, the Indian Mutiny. And that was a very near-run thing because, of course, the sepoys rebelled. Sepoys were the troops that had actually defeated the Indian princes and their forces. So, yeah, that was a very nasty business.
Well,
on both sides.
What's interesting militarily about that, me being a gun collector and that brought about a change in British policy for arming what they called native states. So the sepoys were armed with pattern 53 muskets, which were rifled muskets. And the British saw that they had trained these people. They used British tactics. It was very difficult to subdue. It was with the help of the Gurkhas from Nepal, which was classed as a native state at that time, helped suppress the rebellion. And that was what then formed the Gurkha battalions in the British Army and things like that. But what the British Army did is they changed their rules. They said, if we're going to arm our native state forces, they can't have the same level of equipment that we have.
No.
So they said, well, what are we going to do with all these Pattern 53 muskets? Well, they said, simple, we'll just take them into the armories and we'll smoothbore them.
Yeah.
And so they literally lathed out the rifling, and it meant that the Indian troops had no rifling and the British troops had rifling, and it even carried on up until 1900.
Yeah.
When
And if you want to see what the difference between a smooth barrel and a rifle,
I know all too well the
Right.
differences.
then you just look at the history of the American Civil War.
Yep.
Because the Minet ball, which was sort of like a cartridge,
Yes.
which enabled you to fire your musket much more quickly.
Yes.
But the rifling extended the deadly range of a musket by, you would probably know, 200 or 300 meters.
Yeah, it went from being a 30 to 100-yard weapon to being a 200 to 300-yard weapon. And that
And much
proved,
more accurate.
yeah, it was slower, right? That's why the Minet ball was designed, because it would fit into the rifling, and when fired, the base of the bullet would expand to grip the rifling to impart.
Spin it round, yeah.
Whereas the Baker rifle that the British started off with was their first rifled arm. That required a leather patch to be around the ball to grip the rifling.
Well, that would have increased the amount of smoke and flame.
But they could still shoot 3 rounds a minute with a Baker rifle. With the advent of the Snyder rifle, which was a breech loading rifle, where they basically converted their Pattern 53 muskets to being breech loading, they could go to 10 or 15 rounds.
Yeah. Oh, that was a sea change.
But and then when the Martini Henry came along, and they saw the effectiveness of that in the Zulu Wars.
My grandfather had one of those.
I've got about 8 of them.
These are the ones with the funny little lever
Yes.
at the bottom of
It
the butt.
drops a breech block, and you put it around in.
Single round, no magazine. But yeah, my grandfather was Captain William Marshall of the Otago Mounted Rifles, and he fought in the Boer War. And he had one of those Martini Henry carbines. He also had a Webley service pistol.
Revolver.
Yeah, revolver, correct. But he also brought back a trophy.
Mauser rifle.
A Mod Mauser 7.62, 1890.
It would have been 7.92.
7.92.
Yeah. 8mm Mauser was 7.92.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's where the British realized they were undergunned against the Boers. Undergunned. But again, going back to the native states, Nepal wanted Martini Henrys and they were only allowed Snyders. But the Nepalese were very cunning, and so they went and bought rifles from contractors in India and then reverse engineered them and made them themselves. And famously, a General Gahendra was the instigator of the modernization of the Nepalese army, and he copied a Wesley Richards design, which looked like a Martini Henry, and made 8,983 of those rifles. The reason why I know the number is I have one of them.
Right.
Not one rifle is the same as the next. They are handmade by Carmies or Smiths, and they would have the original one, and they would measure against that. So they armed themselves with modern weaponry through guile and ingenuity. And that's how they did that. So, but the British Army maintained that right up until World War One, where their native states or their colonies were never allowed to have the same weaponry that the British Army had.
Well, there's probably apocryphal story about Allenby, who was the commander in Egypt at the time of Lawrence of Arabia, and of course the Arab tribes were being supplied with small arms,
Mm-hmm.
rifles, and lots of ammunition, revolvers. What did they want? They wanted artillery, of course. And Allenby apparently said to Lawrence of Arabia, when Lawrence put this to him, he said, "We're giving them rifles, and so we're giving them an army. If we give them artillery, we'll be giving them a country," which was a nice way of putting it. My uncle, who grew up with my grandfather's weapons, obviously, he tested the 303.
Mm-hmm.
That was the caliber of the
Enfields.
Yep. And against the Mauser.
Mauser wins every time.
Oh, yeah. He said there was this little tarn, being good Scottish family, that's what they call these little lakes way up in the hills. And he set himself up on a rock, aiming at this little tarn, aiming at the tiny little lake. And he fired the rifle simultaneously. And he said the bullet from the Mauser struck the lake almost instantaneously. So the bang, splash.
Yeah.
The 303, bang, splash.
Yeah, that comes down to propellant.
Yeah.
The British were using cordite, which was the Mauser used a granulated powder. The British used cordite, and cordite was formed in cellulose sticks. So if you open up an old 303 round and tip it out, there's all these, 40 or 50 sticks inside it. It's very slow burning, whereas the granulated powder is very fast burning. But the Boers were using 7mm ones as well, very high velocity. They were using sharpshooters out past 1,000 yards.
Oh, yeah.
With open sights.
Well, I can't remember the name of the battle. It might have been Spienkop, I think. But the Boers were behind rocks.
Yes.
In an elevated position. And they were indeed felling British soldiers at 1,000 yards plus, and mostly with headshots.
Yeah.
Unbelievable marksmen.
Well, it was open country, and they had the high spot, and it was that battle. There was a guy who was a famous African hunter, and I forget his last name, but Karamojo was his nickname. And he shot the most elephants of anyone in the world, and he did most of it with a 7mm Mauser. And there's even a shot that he would use on on elephants, where they'd shoot them behind the ear from behind in order to get into the brain capacity. Because up until then, everybody was using very large caliber firearms like 5.77s, those sorts of things. Elephant gun, they called them. Yeah. And if you look at a Martini Henry in 5.77 450, it's a 45 caliber bullet on a massive case. Compared to a 303, it's a much smaller case of 303 and a much smaller bullet. But there was, again, just changes in technology and things like that allowed the changes. And go back again to the treaty. We had a Stone Age people, and that's not being rude. They were literally Stone Age. There was no metal.
You can always use the word Neolithic. It means exactly the same thing, but sounds slightly more scientific.
Yeah. And they didn't have pots. They couldn't boil water. They managed to survive in New Zealand, which is a very hard place to survive in. And they did really well. But largely since they arrived here somewhere in the 1300s and up to the 1800s, had not changed.
No.
And they were coming up against a technologically superior, strategically superior, tactically superior. I mean, there's a couple of, variations to that, the trench warfare at Ruapeka and Ohio and all of those things. That was innovative, but ultimately they lost because of the superior firepower. It will eventually grind you down. And the Roman Empire found that out when Sultan Mehmet decided that he was going to take Constantinople, and the walls that had stood for 1,000 years tumbled in front of the bombards and the cannons that the Sultan was able to deploy.
And he had a really big cannon.
Yep.
Lots of them.
Yeah, that's right. So again, superior technology overwhelms tactics. They hadn't changed, and by the time Constantinople fell, and the Ottoman Empire surged into Europe after that, there was a close run thing that was happening. And 500 years later, we saw the 19th century, 20th century come upon us, and now it's been pushed back.
Yeah.
Now, to get out of history, but kind of not, you've described yourself as an old New Zealander. What does that identity mean to you? I mean, I've read it, but the listeners might want to understand what you mean by you think you're an old New Zealander.
Well, I mean, I am getting on in years, so I am an old.
Oh, come on, you're looking very sprightly.
But what I meant by that was that I had my formative years and spent my early life living in the New Zealand that we've just been talking about. The New Zealand that was described as the social laboratory of the world. I have at home a set of Richard's encyclopedias, an American set of encyclopedias, and the entry for New Zealand, the subheading is the best governed country in the world. Now, that's all been derided and poo-pooed by historians and sociologists of the modern variety. But I think it's probably wise to say, if you were white, and if you were a bloke, and if you were a heterosexual bloke, the post-war world was a paradise. It really was. And even if you weren't at the top of that particular social hierarchy, things were way better than they had been a generation before, and they were way better than they'd been a generation before that. A friend of mine, Chris Harris, very, very bright guy, he dug out some stats for me a few years ago. Just a comparison, right? Before 1984, year zero of Rogernomics and euthanasia, 36%.
That's when it all changed, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
The 80s is when it all changed.
Absolutely.
Muldoon, and then
most particularly the fourth.
Then Roger Douglas.
Yeah. But in the early 80s, 36% of Maori living in South Auckland owned their own home. Now, the average home ownership in those days was about 67 to 70%. Now, or at the time the stats were collected, the number of Maori living in South Auckland owning their own home, 18.
Just half.
So that's a good metric to show you the difference. But I remember once being asked by NZUSA, of all institutions, to come and talk to one of their Mayor August councils. It must have been one of the last ones they had, I think. And I gave them a speech called Taking Your Time. Right? And I described the New Zealand that I lived in when I was their age. Right? And they just couldn't believe it. Right? And it was about time in a very real sense because, well, people only worked for 5 days, except for the emergency services and people who own dairies. I mean, the country shut for 2 days. If you had a public holiday on a Friday or a Monday, you could go away. You could go away hunting. You go up into the bush for 2 or 3 days, come back again. People did. Lots and lots of people did. Yeah. And it was just, it was a world that was set up particularly for the young, for babies and children and young people. You didn't pay to go to university. You could leave school at 15, get a job in a car assembly plant. That was terrible, inefficient, and grossly wasteful car assembly plant.
It was the euphemism was that there was a Friday car and a Monday car.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
indeed. I suspect that was the same in Detroit, to be honest. But you could leave school, you get a job on one of those car plants, earn award wages, union protections, get married at 20, have your own house, courtesy of a state advances loan by 23, have 4 or 5 kids, because people did have 4 or 5 kids, and have your own hobby, build your own boat, go hunting in the weekends.
Build your own beach house.
Yeah. It was a different country. And
it did change in the 80s because I remember, you know, you're a little bit older than me, but not a lot older than me.
About as older. I'm older than you in the same way that Bob Dylan's older than me. These guys, they're all sort of 12, 15 years older, half a generation.
Yeah. But, you know, I look at my childhood and we rode bikes everywhere.
Yep.
There really wasn't a lot of crime. At the worst, you might have got a clip, if you were cheeky to somebody, but there was very rarely a
murders were
rare
and front page news.
But we could happily, and we did, I mean, I remember cycling to school along Gillies Ave, and we'd try and slipstream the buses. And back in those days, the ARA buses had hooks on the back for prams and things. Well, we would grab hold of the hook, right, and the bus would be at a bus stop, letting someone on or and we would ride up behind them and hold on to the hook and get dragged all the way up Gillies Ave and then up Mountain Road, and there we were at school without having to pedal too hard. You didn't do that these days along Gillies Ave.
Well, parents would be aghast at that story, but see, parents were different too. Well, parents. I remember my mother-in-law. She had this lovely line. She said, "Kids are really hard to lose." She said, I never worried too much about what the kids were up to. They're hard to lose, and parents would just say, "You kids, go off and play."
Yeah,
and that's what we did. And all the psychologists now say, "Oh, this is wonderful, self-actualizing, socializing with your peers," but it was just kids being kids, and you could be a kid then, right?
Well, that's the thing. Like, I remember things that we did, like very early on in the subdivision of Pauanui. Dad had camped out, because you had to do that in those. You camp out on the section that you wanted and be first to the sales thing in the morning, right? It was all old-fashioned style. And you used to have to camp there, and then at 8 o'clock in the morning, whoever grabbed the sign and took it to the sales office would get the sale. And the hoppers were good at doing this, right? So I was lucky in that we had a beach house. Dad built that beach house with his own hands. I helped, and with the kids, we were basically slaves, carting nails and bits of wood, but we did things. And then when we worked hard, we then got to play. Well, my grandfather had gone to the local dump and he had found parts of bikes and he had made me a bike. So, I wasn't a little rich kid running around. Dad had worked hard to save money to get the section and then save money to build the house and then build the house himself and all of those sorts of things. And then we had secondhand bikes. I helped spray paint it yeah, my grandfather was a panel beater, so
Well, that
he
would help.
we had access to tools and things like that. But he would take us fossicking on the beach or round the rocks or go blackberrying. We'd be filling up our caps with blackberries and bringing them all home, and grandma would be turning it into jam and stuff like that. Mum would say to us in the morning, we'd be sitting there at breakfast, we'd helped ourselves to some cereal or something. What have you kids got planned for today? Are you going to be home for lunch? And we could say no. No, oh no, we're going surfing. Oh no, we're going to ride out down the road 5Ks and walk to the waterfall and do all of these crazy things that these days kids would, there'd be signs saying, watch out for the mud or, there might be puddles or something. We were jumping in puddles, back then. And we had a grand old time and we rode everywhere. We stayed out till whatever, but we knew that if mum or dad had said home at 9, you were home at 9. 1 minute past 9, you weren't going out again for a couple of days. So you were home at 9. But we never got in any trouble.
No.
We might have had a few beers, too many, and then cycled into a tree or
It
something.
was, as people still say, and I think it's less true now than it was then, that it was a wonderful country to raise kids in.
But although we knew there were consequences for actions, I look at kids today, and I've brought up a couple of kids, and they're in their 20s now, and they're pretty able. But I see some 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds who won't ring anybody because they might have to talk to them. They won't engage with them and they won't go and get a job because I have to talk to customers. They've become closeted and isolated by technology.
And they lack resilience.
Well, I always say,
I mean, this was what I think, my mother-in-law was really saying, is that kids are very resilient. They're very resourceful. And you need to encourage them to be that because
you can't learn to ride a
the
bike.
world, needs resilience.
Well,
It requires resourcefulness. It's a dangerous place, but you don't get to understand danger unless you learn to live with
You
danger.
can't learn to ride a bike without falling off.
Right. Oh, they're a dangerous machine.
But you look at 1944, D-Day. We had 18-year-olds and some under that had lied, charging off landing craft into the face of withering gunfire from the German army, the most effective fighting force in the world at that time. And nowadays, 18-year-olds need safe spaces at university.
Yeah.
Right? That's only 75, well, nearly 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And we've got a bunch of sooks who, get triggered. That's the one thing that cracks me up. Triggered, by hurty words. Like when you were a kid, your mum said to you, if you came home from school and said, "Oh, Albert Smith called me a dork," your mother would probably shrug her shoulders and go, "Well, he's an idiot." But mum, I'm upset. Well, and she would have said, "Sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you." When did that cease to be relevant?
I don't know. But my parents said exactly the same thing. That's right.
So it's the old.
No, that's the old New Zealand.
That's when Beck was as good as his master.
Yeah, well, there were always masters. Let's not.
There was that one
get carried away. But you see, the masters in those days tended to be people like the Acklins and the Elworthys. These were the great landowners of Hawke's Bay or South.
Or they had done something. I remember my teachers
or they were people like James Wadding,
made something,
who built something, and they had kind of built New Zealand alongside everybody else. And they knew that New Zealand was the place people came to get away from a country where your birth marked you and decided your life, and you couldn't change it. I mean,
But that's
coming
changed now,
out
hasn't it?
here or going to North America was a way of saying, if that, I am going to go and make something of myself in a land where I can make something
Well, like the
of myself.
Scots going to Dunedin,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I mean, what people in Dunedin don't usually understand is that the word Dunedin,
Just means the hill of Edinburgh, just like Edinburgh
That's
means the hill of Eden. Yeah, that's
exactly.
right.
And so they were coming from a very dour, dreary, subjugated society. They were still fighting the English in the 1700s, right?
Disrespectful way to talk about the Scotland of Adam Smith.
Yes, but remember that my family's all come from Scotland.
Yeah, my family comes from Scotland as well. We are very much
My
Lowland Scots, mind you, not Highland Scots. But
I said Dad was Lowland Scots from Galashiels. That's where his family was from. Almost English, really. But Mum's side of Hayes from Keith in the Highlands.
Okay.
So that's where my family comes from. And these people came out for a better life.
Yeah.
You know?
there's some of the people who came to Dunedin, were Presbyterians of a certain kind. And they were dour.
Yes, there's no cushions on the pews in church.
And they didn't believe in dancing or drinking or
No, and
having any kind of good time.
and their hymns were dirges.
Indeed. But not all of Scotland was like that. But the people who did well, there were some who, and the New Zealand company tried to do this deliberately, tried to replicate the class structure of England in New Zealand. Well, that didn't take too well, but in some parts of the country, there were great landowners, the equivalent of the squatters across the Tasman, but they had their estates broken up by the Liberal government, 1891 to 1912, so a long time in office. But the thing was, even if you were rich, even if you owned a lot of property, you knew that this was not the sort of country to flaunt it in. You knew that in this country, the idea that you're better than someone because you're wealthier than they are was never going to go down well. And so you go up into Maury Hill in Dunedin, which is the Remuera of Dunedin, right? Beautiful houses up there, great mansions. But you got to look hard to see them because they're screened by hedges or high walls or big trees.
We've never welcomed ostentatious.
Yes. The idea that you would flaunt, as in the One Roof supplements in the Herald, $43 million man. I mean, you didn't do that. And if you went to Sir John Ackland's homestead up in the Hawke's Bay, you had to travel a long way to get there, and it too was encased in mature trees. So, yes, there was wealth, but the wealthy did not flaunt it and tried not to, with some exceptions like the people who went to Christ College, tried not to be too overt.
So they carried on for a long time, because I can remember when the NBR started its rich list, and they named the Goodfellow family in the rich list. Now, I lived in Manurewa at that time, in Hill Park, which is kind of an island of Europeanness in Manurewa, and some of the Goodfellows lived down the road from us. I went to school with some of them. And there was great consternation in the Goodfellow family, and William Goodfellow said, "I'm not having a bar of this rich list. I don't want to be on the rich list. I don't want to be thought of as rich. So I'm going to give away all my money. And promptly went and did that. Nowadays, people are trying to get on the rich list, and there's people on there that don't want to be on there that are. But that attitude was still around even up to the 90s, because I can remember Dad being an electorate chair and then a regional chair of the National Party, the so-called Tories, the party of the rich people. And he would say to candidates, I see you've got a Mercedes. Yes. You need to park it in the garage for the duration of the election and go and get yourself an old Holden or a Ford or even a Toyota and drive around in that. And back then also, when you were a salesperson, you didn't want to have a very flash car as a salesperson.
Okay, well, I'll put this to you, Cam, and you've got a background in the National Party, so you're well placed to comment. I read Barry Gustafson's history, 50 years, whatever it was called.
He was a cloth cap socialist.
He was at one stage.
Who turned.
Yes.
I can remember chatting to him in Mum and Dad's lounge, actually. Yeah.
He wrote a wonderful book about the origins of the Labour Party. Yeah, it's another story. But what I found absolutely fascinating in the history of the National Party was that from the very start, it was to be a mass party.
Broad church, as we say these days.
And it was to be a democratically organized party.
Yes.
Because the people who founded National were intelligent men, and they knew that if they recreated the old Reform or the old United Party, which were Carter parties really, they had a brief existence at election time and then sort of fell away and then came up again, much like the parties of today came. But he knew that the Labour Party was a mass party.
Yes.
It was democratically organized. And the only way to compete with it successfully was for the Party of Conservative New Zealand to also be a mass party. And they insisted, and the guy who was one of the prime organizers insisted that policy making and candidate selection be with the party.
Yep.
Right?
And it used to be like that until John Key.
Yep. Until, what was his name? He's still about. He's going to take over the Herald any day now. Stephen Joy.
Corporatized the National Party. Removed the power of the board. Vested the power essentially for policy making in the caucus. And then in the caucus, basically to 5 people, which in the National Party is affectionately known as the kitchen cabinet.
Yeah. And
that is the start of the demise of the National Party as I knew it, because just to bring,
let me tell you, not as overtly and not as perhaps you could say honestly as Stephen Joyce's reforms, but Labour now is effectively the same kind of party.
Yep. You don't have anybody there in the senior parts of any major political party that's ever had a real job.
And what that has done to both parties is it has just opened up this vast gulf between what more and more people now call the political class.
Or political elites.
Yeah. And the people they claim to represent. Whereas in both National and Labour, and I was part of this.
Oh, so was I.
Yeah. You had debates. You had huge policy fights.
Well,
we had speeches.
I was brought up.
We had organising at the branch level.
Yeah.
These were large, and National in the end outbid Labour in terms of mass parties. Under Muldoon, you had something like 250,000 members. Just
look,
unbelievable.
I was brought up
Anderton brought it up to, in 1984, the party had roughly 100,000 paid-up members, not counting the affiliated unions.
Yeah. Well, I was brought up in Eden electorate. Right?
Oh, yes.
And there was two halves to Eden electorate. It was more like 2/3 to 1/3, but we had Tiger Country.
Yep.
Right? And that was everything on one side of Mount Eden Road, across Dominion
Going down Duke Street, Landscape Road. Yes, I know.
All of that. We used to call it Tiger Country, but we would go down.
State houses, far as the eye could see. And one of the first state housing developments in New Zealand.
And we'd put, Perry Road even. We'd put pamphlets and letterboxes and things like that. We'd go to public meetings. There would be hundreds of people turn out for a public meeting in the Mount Eden War Memorial Hall.
Yeah.
And we'd have strategically we even had teams of people as young nats and things like that to counter the rowdies from the Labour Party.
Yep.
And Scott Simpson cut his political chops.
Yep.
In Eden electorate. He taught me all the dirty tricks that I know. So.
Oh, look.
And
I remember when Nicky Hager's dirty politics, right? And people like my dear ex-comrade Martin Bradbury, went bananas.
Yeah.
All right.
They lost their shit.
And I was always bemused by this because I spent years in the Labour Party.
And this is the thing, right?
And
we used to
think the Nats invented dirty tricks?
Like, I don't remember really Eden electorate meetings, right? And there would be sledging. I learned how to sledge properly, you'd wait till there was a pause and then out with something, and you learned to make people laugh. If you got all angry, then people got annoyed with you.
Well, let me tell you a story from the other side on the fence. Muldoon began the 1975 election campaign thinking the Founders Theatre in Hamilton, which was not unusual. Hamilton being the sort of bellwether city. And Muldoon was revving up. There was a pause. My father-in-law and his mate at the back of the hall, stalwart Labour, shouted out, "Who stabbed Jack in the back?"
Who stabbed Jack in the back?
Jack Marshall.
Yeah, Jack Marshall.
But yeah, I mean, but
everyone laughed.
Yeah,
right.
This was the politics that you and I grew up with. This was mass politics. This was where people were engaged.
Heckling with an art.
In 1984, 93.7% of registered voters cast a vote.
I remember 84. That's when Richard Northey got elected. Right? And it was hilarious because I'd been involved in all these selections in Eden electorate, watching what's going on in Eden electorate and those sorts of things. Absolutely hilarious shenanigans that would go on, At one stage, Hiwi Taura, the race relations conciliated, decided he'd stand for the National Party. And it was like, Hiwi Taura standing for the National. Dad was the electorate chair at that time in Eden. And I remember Hiwi Taura coming into our house, and Dad had some carvings on the wall of a patu and various different things. And Hiwi Taura came in and he looked at it and he looked it up and down and he stood to the side and looked like this around these. He said, those are carvings by such and such. And Dad said, no, they're not. They're carvings by my grandfather. And Hiwi Taura said he learnt from him then.
Yeah.
Said, yes, that's right. When my grandfather came back from World War I, wounded from Gallipoli, he was in a rehabilitation hospital in Rotorua. And
now, here's the thing.
And he learnt to carve.
Let me just interrupt here. Yeah. If your grandfather was wounded at Gallipoli.
Not my grandfather, Dad's grandfather.
Dad's grandfather, your great-grandfather was wounded at Gallipoli. There's a better than even chance that he received at least first aid from my grandfather.
Well, here's another connection.
Because he was
my
great medical officer at Gallipoli.
Joined the army in Otago.
Well, there you are.
So there you are. He still had a Scottish accent.
Yep.
And he went to Gallipoli and lost part of his leg to Turkish shrapnel. The surgeon who grafted the skin across from one leg, he had his legs sewn together so they could graft the skin across from one leg to the other. He then became the driver of that surgeon back in New Zealand and married that surgeon's cook.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where my great-grandfather came. But Hiwitara was astonished at this carving. But this was before the selection had gone ahead. And it was held in a hall in Mount Eden. And they had offices or rooms downstairs. And all the candidates would go downstairs during the selection process. And then they'd get to come up and make a speech. And then they'd come back down to the room. Well, Hiwitara drew the short straw. He had to go first, right, out of 5. Right? Last is the best.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. But he drew the short straw. And I was down in that room because I was, Dad's son. And so I was to supervise the candidates so they couldn't hear what the others were saying or whatever. Hiwitara gets up and he had this very self-deprecating approach to things. He sort of shuffled as well. He always looked a little bit like the wreck of the Hesperus. Anyway, he went up there and did his 5-minute speech or 10, whatever it was. And all the way through, there was all this laughter and applause and everything like that. And then he came back down and he opened the door and walked in. The other 4 were all sitting there. I was sitting there. And they was, how'd it go? And he says, I tell you what, don't tell a joke early on. He says that they use up all your time. Right. And it was I didn't realize it at the time. It's only now with experience over 40 odd years in politics that I realized that he was just his head game was well in advance of the others. He won that selection from first speaking slot. And the whole National Party in Eden Electorate was like, oh my God, what have we done? But he was brilliant. Yeah. Unfortunately, he didn't become an MP, which is a tragedy.
It is a shame.
Because I think he would have been a great MP. Yeah.
Well, when it comes to oratory, Maori may not have had muskets, but they did have the ability to speak.
Well, you know what? My good friend Simon Lusk, he trains a lot of politicians. And the National Party decided they'd try and block him training politicians. But he found a way around that and he carries on training politicians. But he enjoys training Maori candidates far more than European candidates. And he said the reason for that is I don't need to train them how to speak publicly. They've learnt it on the marae. And he continually gets his candidates elected in various councils around the world, around New Zealand, in general seats.
Yeah.
Right.
Look, I remember once being at one of those tumultuous Labour Party conferences, annual conferences, when Rogernomics was sort of being rammed through.
Yeah.
And we took a leaf out of the British Labour Party's playbook and we had these sort of side meetings, the way they do in Britain.
Breakout groups.
Yeah, sort of thing. And anyway, I remember being at one of these and this guy steps forward and delivers just the most spine-tingling speech. And his name was Dover Samuels. And before you knew it, he was on the New Zealand Council of the Labour Party. But Dover just had this extraordinary facility.
Well, you just look at Winston Peters in full flight.
Oh, yeah.
Right? No one can touch him, right? Christopher Luxon thinks he's all that in a bag of chips, right? And I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, you're actually salt and vinegar chips, and the bag's been open a week.
Soggy chips.
Soggy chips.
Worst kind.
But that brings me to the 2023 election results. Now, we might have slightly different views on this, but I'm betting that we'll pretty much agree. Did you see that as a rejection of Labour or an endorsement of the centre-right?
Oh, I think it was undoubtedly a rejection of Labour and a prophylactic vote, frankly.
A purgative.
No, I mean, it was a vote cast to prevent things happening,
Yeah.
to stop things happening.
That's where we saw the ACT Party in New Zealand first do rather well, and the National Party moderately well. Is that what you're saying is to stop things happening?
It was at all costs to prevent the re-election of a Labour Green. No one really had much idea what Te Pāti Māori was about in those days.
I think we know now.
We do now.
Yep.
Yeah.
They are unrepentant racists.
I would prefer to call them ethno-nationalists, but some people would call that racism, certainly. I mean, if the people practicing it were white, they would definitely call it
Racist. Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, and I was one of those people. I always say to people, what did O'Brien do to force Winston Smith, the hero of 1984, to indicate his utter subordination? Right? He would hold up 4 fingers. How many fingers am I holding up? And until Winston Smith was able to answer 5, he would keep on being tortured. Now, when someone tries to tell me that 2 + 2 = 5, I'm not going to vote for them. I will not be told that 2 + 2 = 5. Right? And more people on the left will not let you in the door unless you agree that 2 + 2 = 5.
See, I describe the Ardern-Hipkins years, as the gaslighting government. They gaslit the whole country. We were told we're going to have a well-being budget, right? And then promptly never used that term again. That we were going to have literally motherhood and apple pie and kindness. And they had the opposite of all of that. They made extravagant promises that they never even attempted to try and get.
Well, I think it's worse than that.
And then told us that it was wonderful and that they'd farted, but that was fresh air that you were smelling.
Let's never forget, and it's really important not to forget, that the Labour Party was elected with 50.05% of the party vote.
And then burnt it.
Which should be impossible.
It should. That's why MMP was invented, to prevent that.
So clearly, half the country, a great many of whom had voted National in the previous election, someone put the figure at something like 400,000 or something, ridiculously large. Right? So what had happened, in my view, it was that period 12 to 18 months before the 2020 election, had persuaded people that Jacinda and Labour should be returned to office. Now, COVID, I think, saved her bacon, because if it hadn't been for COVID, I think their failure to deliver would have been clearer sooner. The first 9 or 10 months of COVID, New Zealand did well. Let's face it.
Well, we're
hard not to do well when you're
in the middle of an ocean.
That's right, and you close the borders. However, that was the case. But then the next 3 years, then it became clear that they could not deliver. That even when they tried to deliver, they had a public service that had forgotten how.
They also had a competence issue.
Well, yes, as the rapid turnover of cabinet ministers indicated towards the end. But it was this inability to get anything done. And then I think most seriously, the way that Jacinda handled Omicron, the variant. Now, there were promises made to New Zealanders. There were claims advanced to New Zealanders about the nature of the vaccine, about the mandatory or non-mandatory nature of the vaccination program, which were contradicted by reality, shall we say. Jacinda had promised that there would be no mandatory vaccination.
No, she lied.
And she broke that promise. They said it was a vaccine. Now,
That was a lie too.
You and I grew up with vaccines for polio, for
Measles,
all that sort of stuff,
yep.
right? And when we were growing up, you got a vaccine
and you didn't get sick.
And you didn't get sick. So whatever it was that we were getting
wasn't
a vaccine. And see, people like me, right, were absolutely staunch in the first 12, 18 months because I believed them.
You've been involved in politics all your life.
No.
Did you believe them?
No. Well, see, this is a measure, Cam. Maybe you got there sooner than I did. But the person I am growing up in the years that I grew up, it simply never occurred to me that the government of the day, when faced by a global pandemic, would not work with the medical fraternity and give us accurate information and organize things in a way which protected New Zealanders from what was a threat. And you had to see what happened in Italy or India or United States to know that people died from this.
People die from the flu every year.
Yes, I know. They don't die from the flu the way they died in Italy or Great Britain or the United States. They don't die that way. But that period between 2020 and 2023 was one in which trust and confidence in government and in the authorities generally was wantonly and unnecessarily demolished for thousands and thousands of New Zealanders. And we are still suffering from the impact of that.
The turning point that I put down to the demise of Ardern and ultimately the Labour Party was the parliamentary protest. That's what I see as the tipping point. Up until that protest, there was no recognition that there was a significant proportion of the New Zealand population that were suffering until they drove down to Wellington and decided to stay. And then when you saw the actions of Trevor Mallard and the media
standing alongside him on that great balcony, which was so reminiscent of Ceausescu's Romania, and literally looking down
with disdain.
Those are hard images to...
People forget that a few short years ago, a bunch of rowdy school kids stood there and said, down with oil and gas production, and Jacinda Ardern went out and spoke to them and announced that that's what they were going to do. Here's a considerably larger amount of people across all walks of life, and if you were at the protest, and I was, There were Maori, there were Pacific, there was workers, there were firemen, there was police, there was office workers, all there.
There were drainage contractors, which kind of paid to Trevor Mallard's sprinkler system.
There was coordination and organisation at a grassroots level, which was, as an old-fashioned Kiwi, seeing everybody mucking together. There was none of the things that we were told. The police came out and said, "Oh, it's very dangerous. There's people with pitchforks." Did they show us a photo of a pitchfork? Did they show us a person with a pitchfork? No. That was the pretext that they had for moving the police in. And on the first day, they resisted the police. And then they were camped there for a month. And then again, they've got larger amounts of police. And then they came in with the tear gas and the smoke and the riot gear and the stormtrooper behaviour. And here we have
pepper spray, not tear gas. Ever used tear gas in New Zealand?
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I saw some of those launchers.
I'm pretty sure those were those beanbag launchers that we've seen recently in Los Angeles. We've yet to cross that threshold.
No, well, they were using them on that day. They're made by Heckler and Koch, a German manufacturer. The New Zealand police have numerous amounts of them. They were using sound weapons. They were using all sorts of things against a population that simply wanted to be heard. And I was talking to politicians there. I said, go out there and set a tent up on the forecourt, sit down and talk to people, and the protest will disappear overnight. And they refused. And that to me was the tipping point. That's when Jacinda Ardern realized she was toast. That not everybody loved her.
A wee bit later than that. I remember being fairly hostile, from my
as you are,
from my vantage point in Auckland, to the protest. I was slowly brought round by people like Bryce Edwards. He actually went and did what you did. He went out and walked through and talked to people. And he said to me, there are some people there who are very angry. There are people there who are mouthing the sort of stuff you hear on, social media from the United States. Sure. But then again, I remember being on one of the big protests against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where a certain Irish radical of my acquaintance was guillotining effigies of the government.
Yeah.
And the left didn't have a word to say about that.
No.
But it was when Price and others began to say, actually, a lot of this is whipped up prejudice. And, he came under enormous attack from his fellow leftists for what he had written.
That's that polarization again. If you're on our team or you're not on our team.
Well, you certainly weren't supposed to say the sort of things that Bryce was saying and that others were saying. I mean, I think Martin Bradbury was always of the view that, however rough around the edges, these people had a point. And by the end of it, I'd sort of reached that conclusion myself. One of the reasons it took so long to clear those grounds is because it took the police at least a fortnight to assemble sufficient force to clear Parliament grounds without the use of deadly force. I mean, you can clear Parliament grounds in 30 seconds if you open up with a machine gun, but that's likely to cause even more trouble. But But that's something people should bear in mind.
No, the power of the state.
No, the power of the state in this country is negligible.
No, that's where I was going to get to, right?
Negligible.
If you have a discussion with people who are military historians and things like that, it invariably comes up a question. This is not fomenting insurrection or anything. It's just an academic discussion. If you wanted to take over New Zealand, let's say you're China and you want to take over New Zealand, how would you do it? Well, it'd be all over in half a day, because we don't really have an army. Our navy's all parked at Devonport.
Or on the bottom of the Pacific.
There's no armed guards at Devonport. There's no armed guards at Wairau. There's
no armed guards at Bryce Norton in the UK.
There's no armed guards in the parliamentary precinct. It's like a coup in Suva. A coup in Suva happens because the army takes one bridge there and one bridge there, and then surrounds 4 or 5 streets in Suva, and that's the whole government taken care of. No shooting required. We have a coup, and that's what we'll do. And if you speak our line, we'll take you behind the building and give you a hiding. You could do that in New Zealand very quickly, because the power of the state is not that powerful. They like to use courts to make people suffer.
Yeah.
They like to lock you up. But ultimately, if enough people,
What I would say is this. New Zealand has been a very, as you say, peaceful society for a very long time.
We go along to get along.
And the maintenance of law and order in New Zealand is conceptualized in terms that do not involve lethal force. As I said, if you're willing to open fire on a crowd, you can disperse it very rapidly, very quickly.
But you then have to be prepared to defend yourself when the pushback comes.
That's right. But in doing that, you are precipitating either civil war or revolution or both.
Well, there's 250,000 people with firearms licenses, and there aren't that many soldiers.
Exactly. Nowhere near that many soldiers. And, in the past, the state of New Zealand did used to occasionally have recourse to, if not lethal force, then considerably greater force than it was used.
You have these horses charge at you.
Yeah, there were Massey's Cossacks in 1913, and you had the Cossacks again, actually, after the Queen Street riots of 1932, the Waikato Cockey's came up. And in 1951, you had compulsory military training, and they took conscripts and put them on the wharves, which was a very dangerous thing to do for the poor conscripts. And in 1981, at HMS Philomel, which is what the naval bases I've referred to apparently, the ratings were in readiness in case they were called upon to aid the civil power, which currently came pretty close on that last day of the Springbok tour. But opening fire, not so much. But once again, in the past, you had a larger army, and you had
veterans as well.
You had a lot of veterans, and you also had a large reserve, territorials.
Yeah, it's not so large now.
No. So if push came to shove, there was a pretty large force that you could draw upon. Well, one of the side effects of COVID was it completely wrecked our armed forces.
Completely, utterly wrecked them. And
I remember people laughing at a piece I wrote, and I said, you should conscript or, recruit basically an army of COVID enforcers, the people to watch over the, whatever they call them, quarantine areas, right?
Quarantine facilities.
Yes, because you cannot ask people who signed up to the Army, Navy, and Air Force to do this. This is not their job. Like, called upon in a real emergency like a hurricane or a flood or something, yeah, sure. They've got the big high trucks and all the rest
But
of it.
guarding people
But guarding
while
people
they sit in a hotel room,
in a hotel, that is not the army's job, and it wasn't the army's
it
job.
turns
And
people
that's what they
against
did.
authority.
Yeah, well, it turns people against the army, turned people against the police. It was, yeah.
It was a topsy-turvy time, and, what I can't believe is that New Zealanders fell for it, because I can remember in 2008, David Farrer and I travelling around the country in the blogmobile. You might have remembered that.
I do, yes.
Well, we had lunch with Jacinda Ardern in Morrinsville at an ACT Party person's house who was friends with the Arderns, and she was invited to lunch with us. Well, we had a 3-hour lunch. It was rather nice. And I came out of that lunch, and I said to David Farrell, well, what do you think of her? And he waxed lyrical about her and said she was wonderful, she was this, she said. And I said, I think she's full of shit.
You would, Cam, wouldn't?
I said, she's a cloth cap socialist.
No, she's not. Never, never, ever has been.
She was the president of the National Union of Soviet.
Let me set you straight on that, right? I mean,
she's a narcissist.
Look, I'm not going to get into any of that, but anybody who thinks that Jacinda Ardern is even a democratic socialist as per the Labour Party constitution doesn't know what a democratic socialist is. She has never been that. She has been a social liberal. Yes, she was in the International Socialist Youth or whatever the hell it was.
Comrade this and
but so were an awful lot of people who ended up in the Blair government. She went and worked alongside Tony.
That's what I was going to qualify it.
I mean, she was never a cloth cap socialist. And I defy you to find anything she's ever written or said which acknowledges any such
I was going to qualify that. Right, as she has the appearance of being a cloth cap socialist. If you look at her speeches from the International Union of Socialist Youth, it is littered with the words "comrade."
Yeah,
right. It's before
Labour Party was littered with "comrade,"
but it's performative.
Well,
right?
Yeah, in a way.
And that's what he always was. Yeah, he was a collection of bumper sticker slogans.
And I am sure that within the National Party, there are a whole heap of little behavioral tics and linguistic sort of formula. And that's your conservative culture.
Yeah.
Well, the Labour Party culture in Britain, Labour Party culture in New Zealand and Australia, it's full of those as well.
No.
But you look at what Jacinda actually did and what she didn't do, and
remember, this is 2008 that I'm talking about.
Call her a socialist.
No, but this is 2008. What we had to go on was a couple of speeches where she's talking about comraders. I had 3 hours.
2008? Oh, well, that's going back a ways, right? She'd have been working for Helen then, wouldn't she?
Correct. And she was shoulder tapped, was on the list in 2008. But that 3 hours told me everything I needed to know about Jacinda Ardern, that she actually isn't smart. She has a collection of bumper sticker slogans and then sticks to those despite the evidence to the contrary. And that's her entire premiership was all about that. It was all about headlines, not about actually doing anything.
Well, yeah, I think that's a criticism I would heartily endorse. I'm more generous to Jacinda than you. I think she had a natural talent for communication.
Well, she had a degree in that, of course.
Yeah, and
she must have read Goebbels' book about propaganda, and she certainly has read 1984.
She could certainly communicate, but communication is all very well, but if it becomes separated from action and from achievement, then politically you've got big problems. I mean, David Lange was a superb communicator.
Yeah.
But he was a very poor politician.
So that's the thing with Jacinda Ardern. She had the big slogans and the PR campaign. And, now what we see in retrospect, she always had a TV her own private film crew. That's where the movie came from, was all right from the get-go. The whole thing was performative, right? Everything that she did was for cameras, for a
Well, that's the way
document.
it
That's how
works
she
now.
planned it.
That's the way it works now. That's what Donald Trump does. Virtually everything Trump does before it
Came
happened.
undone for her because she had Phil Twyford, who would be out there being the proponent for Kiwi Build, making these grandiose statements. Where's he now? He's still an MP, but you haven't heard from him in how long? Since he was basically rinsed of that job because of the lack of performance.
Mm.
But anyway, enough of the Labour Party. Let's talk about the lunatics and the Greens. Oh, sorry, I'm being a bit, forward there, but how do they end up going from the party of Jeanette Fitzsimons and Rod Donald, who were honourable people, who believed in the environment, to this bunch of pandering Nancys who clutch at every little minority group, whether it's Palestinians or trans people or any other type of marginalized weirdo group, and don't say anything much about the environment at all, and in fact are shoving taxes and socialism and communism down our throat as hard as they can.
Well, you've got to understand what made the Green movement internationally and in New Zealand. There was always a very strong environmental strain. And in New Zealand, you had things like the Save Manapori campaign and the Save Native Forests and all that sort of direct action. But this was the country of the Values Party as well, let's not forget, which is arguably the first
Green
Party in the world. And it was all about a world moving beyond scarcity, a world of tremendous technological capability, and a world, therefore, that could solve all problems and live lightly on the earth, as the Greens like to put it. And all the evils of the past would be blown away into history. Now, that was a strong element, and that's always been a strong element within green movements internationally as well. But then there was another element, and this is the one that has emerged to dominate the Greens of today, and that is identity politics. A few more years back, it was referred to as the new social movements, feminism, anti-racism, gay rights, identity politics, especially after the free market revolution of the 80s, which kind of cut off the avenues to economic levers which were available.
I love that term, levers. They always use that in government. Oh, there's levers that we can pull.
Well, yeah. But there are bugger all now because Roger Douglas and Ruth Richardson got rid of them.
And Rodney Hyde.
So if that road is blocked, then there's not many roads left. And the Greens in particular became more and more prey to a very radical kind of identity politics, to the point that they have now reached where, I'm constantly amazed by the polls, which show them pretty solidly at 10%. Now, I would have thought, and this is just a reflection of my age, I think that with the stands they've taken on a whole host of issues, they would have dropped below 5. But they haven't. They've stayed pretty steady. So they've got a place.
They always poll better in the polls than they do in the elections.
Well, that's true, but 10%, there's a lot of slippage there between 10 and 5. They nearly lost. This is one of the great ironies, okay, of recent Green history. Remember Materia, Hooray, and her Jean Valjean, do you hear the people sing? Sticking it to the social welfare people, which turned out to be a slightly different story in the end. And they plummeted from 15. I don't know whether at some point they had actually fallen below 5% in the polls, but they were hovering very close. And they were rescued by a white, heterosexual male called James Shaw. And he really did. And they came in with, 6%? They only just made it back. And I watched that whole thing unfold. He single-mindedly rescued that party from itself.
And then they dumped him.
Well, and then they tried to unelect him. It's a bizarre electoral system, but that's what happened. There was also a very strong treatyist element. Catherine Delahunty was always, very, very strong promoter of Te Tiriti. But
Mad Cath.
But put the treatyist element alongside the identity politics element, and you've pretty much got the Greens of today. Although it's interesting, at some point in the last few weeks, months perhaps, I think Chloe Swarbrick has woken up and smelt the coffee, because you notice she no longer wears a keffiyeh.
Terrorist tea towel.
And rather than chant free, free Palestine, she's gotten all socialistic. And their budget is indeed a redistributive document fit to beat the band, which indicates to me that she is trying to steer the ship as far as she can, and I don't know how far it is really, away from the identity politics and not so much away from the treaty, but perhaps to not talk about it quite as much, to try and get people to vote Greens for economic change as opposed to
with that
cultural
budget
change. Well, the thing about MMP is you're not aiming to win 50% past one, Cam.
No. This is the problem, though, that Christopher Hipkins has, isn't it? Apart from Te Pāti Maori, is the lunacy of the Greens. Like, if you and Chris Hipkins is facing this right now, he's on a par with National in the polls, on a par with Luxon. I mean, that says a lot about Luxon, or a start, that Christopher Hipkins can beat him in the preferred prime minister, and Labour is sometimes the head of National. But this is a problem that when push comes to shove, when the polling booths open, that people are going to sit there and go, well, we can go red or blue again, but if we vote red, we're also getting green and black. And will they actually vote red if they're going to be beholden to the Greens and Te Pāti Maori?
Well, that's the biggest problem he faces.
And I think that when push comes to shove, that Kiwis won't do that. I mean, Matt McCartan said to me once that New Zealand politics is a game of two halves, which is trite, but he then explained it and said, a government that does okay in its first term will win a second term. If they perform okay in the second term, then we'll let them play another game in the first half. And if we're sick of them by then, well, then they're out. And if you look at MMP, we really haven't had a one-term. We haven't had a one-term.
No, it
government.
hasn't been a one-term government since
been
1975.
and out.
50 years since we had a one-term government.
Yeah, it's three and out. So the math says that the national-led government will be re-elected, but there may be a redistribution between New Zealand First and ACT and National.
Oh, yes. That would be my prediction at this stage of the game.
Yeah, my wish is to see a depleted National Party to remove the Arab.
I think you'll get your wish.
Yeah, and an increased New Zealand First and ACT. And if I look at looking at politics as long as I've looked at it, and which is as long as you've looked at it, this is the first time that New Zealand First mid-term has still been above 5% in the polls. And New Zealand First always gains in the polls in the elections. And so if they're still at 6%, now we could be looking at 10%.
It's certainly an opportunity for Peters over the next 18 months to build towards that.
That's why he's not the Deputy Prime Minister now.
Yeah, that's why he went first. I think that's a real possibility. And I think the thought processes you describe are likely to be the thought processes of a majority of the electorate.
See, I'm seeing.
I think that could be changed if Hipkins was braver, or if there was someone within the ranks of the Labour Party with the requisite courage and coherent thought to do it. But were I Hipkins, I would simply rule out the Greens and Te Pāti Māori.
Yeah.
See, Willie Jackson, who is the man who keeps Hipkins in power, by the way.
Another racist.
Well,
or you'd say ethno-nationalist.
I'd say shrewd operator.
Yeah. Oh, I like Willie. Yeah. He's a rascal, right? I like him.
He is a shrewd operator, but he is an operator. That was their really clever strategy for retaking the Māori seats. They didn't let any of the candidates onto the list. So basically the deal was this: you either vote Labour twice or you're not going to get Labour at all. And they won all the seats, lo and behold. And it was a really, really clever tactic. And Hipkins, advised by Willie, should do the same. It should. So as it's currently constituted and with its current policies, Labour can work with neither the Greens nor Te Pāti Māori.
But that's what they're forced to be. And Hipkins is stupidly saying, yeah.
Well, you see, he shouldn't, but that would force an awful lot of people to make some hard choices, which is what Labour needs them to do anyway. I mean, in the broader political scheme of things, that's what New Zealanders need to do. They need to, we either this way or we go this way, but we need a mandate to do either. So that's what I would do. And I reckon he would take a huge amount of votes off the Greens.
He would decimate the Greens.
Whether he'd drive them below 5, I don't know, but he'd drive them bloody close. And I think it would focus Māori opinion as well.
Bold. It'd be bold,
yeah.
Right? But of course, that's a great strategy, but it doesn't account for what Winston Peters is about to do to them. Because I can see this coming, where Winston Peters is going to make a play. He already is. If you listen to his words and you watch what he's putting out there on social media, and the play is very definitely at very middle New Zealand and working class New Zealand. The Jack's as good as his master type people, saying we don't want to be told by these elites what to do. We want to put New Zealand first. We want to put New Zealand workers first. We want to use the resources that we've got in New Zealand first. That is a play that's old school Labour and old school National Party.
Yeah.
And he's got similar principles and views to the founding documents of the National Party. The National Party's forgotten where they've come from, and so has the Labour Party. They've forgotten where they got started. And that's left this massive amount there of people to get over their pathological hatred of Winston Peters that the National Party supporters have had, and the Labour Party people have had about Winston Peters. And he's showing us how to do things.
I think that the open ground is there for New Zealand First. If anyone can occupy it, it's Winston. And he has got the boldness to pull that sort of political maneuver off. I seriously doubt if Chris Hipkins has it. And I look at the Labour Party caucus and see if in terms of that sort of political talent, it's bereft.
So what you're saying is true. If Hipkins said, I'm not going to work with the Greens, they're batshit crazy, it becomes a truism. If he says, I'm not going to work with the Maori Party because they're racists, it becomes a truism. And all of a sudden, he's making a play for the middle ground and Winston again.
Exactly.
Right. And Winston and...
I'll tell you what else it would do. It would set Labour up to go into coalition with Winston.
Or national.
Wouldn't it?
But it would. And the thing is, though, is if
as it did once before,
and if Winston Peters came out and Christopher Luxon came out and Seymour came out and said, yeah, no, we agree with Christopher Hipkins. We're not going to work with the Greens or Te Pāti Maori. We're not going to have separatism. We're not going to have these sorts of things. At best, Te Pāti Maori would have 6 seats and be as ineffectual as they are now.
At best.
And Labour would pick up a lot of the Green votes, a good chunk of Te Pāti Maori votes, because being outside of the tent is being not in the tent at all. Right? You can be outside and on the edges, but it's better to be in the tent playing.
And if they scraped over 5%, which they have made a habit of doing over the years of the MMP, there's no necessity for Chris Hipkins to bring them into any kind of government.
No, you could be a minority government.
Yeah.
And make arrangements with the National Party on the economic situations.
You just dare them to bring down the government. Yeah. Because we said, that's fine. I'll just get hold of the Governor-General, we'll have an election. What do you think will happen to the Green Party?
Well, the other thing, though, is the Governor-General would then turn to the opposition leader, might be the National Party or whatever, and say, well, can you form a government? And if they were smart, they'd say no and have an election.
Yeah, that would be... Constitutionally, that would probably be...
But that's how MMP works, right? MMP works. If the Governor-General says, well, you don't have the numbers, thank you for coming and telling me that, the next call's to the leader of the opposition, can you put together a government? They'll say, give us a couple of days.
That's when you've not got a parliament.
Yeah.
Right. The Governor-General, because Hardy Boys or whatever his name was, wrote a paper on this. Tried laboriously worked my way through, but...
Any person with a double-barrel name's like that, though.
But if Hipkins was the Prime Minister at the time, this is just for the sake of argument, constitutionally, he advises the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament. Parliament gets dissolved. It would be a very brave and probably rather short-lived Governor-General who then refused to take the advice of his or her ministers and went to someone else. That's kind of what John Kerr did. And it worked, but...
I've left a curveball for you for the last bit, Chris.
What a surprise, Cam.
I want to know what your gut feel is about Christopher Luxon. Everyone knows what my gut feel is about Christopher Luxon, but I'm interested in your view. Is he going to go down as a good, even a good prime minister, or will it be something else?
I think Christopher Luxon is the worst prime minister that I can recall.
Since Jacinda Ardern.
No, I think he's worse than her, because he has never captured the hearts of New Zealanders. He has never inspired them to give National 50.05% of the vote.
He hasn't even approached John Key levels of support.
No. Or people say, oh, he's Key's protege, but Key was a very interesting bag of tricks.
Well, he had a few things that he wanted. He only got two of them, right? One was a knighthood, and the other was to be prime minister, right? But he didn't get his fourth term, and he didn't get to beat Keith Holyoake, which I know were his goals.
Yeah.
Which I said to him at the time when he told me what those goals were, you're dreaming, right? You need to beat Keith Holyoake. You have, for the longest serving prime minister, in the modern era, you have to win 5 elections.
No, if he had won the one he didn't contest, the one he gave to Bill English, he could have because don't forget, Keith Holyoake was elected in late November, early December 1960, but he stepped aside in favour of Jack Marshall early in 1972.
Yeah, but if you look at the list of prime ministers and the time served in years and days, Holyoake's up there, right?
Oh yeah,
he's certainly the longest serving national prime minister.
I'm trying to work out whether he was longer than Massey or... Anyway, the three longest are Richard John Seddon, and then it's either Keith Holyoake and Bill Massey or Bill Massey.
But in order for him to do that,
if he had seen out 3 whole terms, he would have.
But he didn't.
No, he didn't.
Yeah, he didn't even get to Muldoon.
Oh yeah, he got to Muldoon.
No, he didn't. Muldoon lasted for 3 whole terms.
Oh, he did.
Snap election. That it was
75.
Go and have a look at the list.
78. That's 3.
I'll put money on it.
1. Oh yeah. No, he didn't, because it was a snap election.
Snap election, but it's longer than Key was prime minister.
Oh well.
I'll put money on that.
Yeah. No, anybody can just go to Professor Google and get the answer immediately.
Like, I went to Auckland Grammar School, and John Graham was the headmaster. And if he caught you with your hands in your pockets, he would upbraid you so you knew about it. He continued to catch you with your hands in your pockets. He had a pocket full of safety pins that he would safety pin your pockets closed.
Oh, goodness.
Right? My grandfather used to mock people who stood and talked with their hands in their pockets, and he was a funny guy, my grandfather. He would say, oh, look, it's a world champion pocket billiards player. And I look at photo after photo after photo of Christopher Luxon standing, talking to dignitaries or whatever, and he's always got his hands in his pockets. Now, you're sitting there frowning.
No, I'm trying to think. Have I noticed that? I'm going to look for it now.
You will not.
Bottom dollar.
Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Stop looking for it either. Yeah.
And it's kind of a little quirk that I have, that I pick the weakness of a politician. And I do that a number of ways, by watching lots of videos of them, looking at lots of photos, listening to them with my eyes closed, all of those sorts of things. Like Jacinda Ardern famously said that she's never told a lie in politics, right? Which was a lie. Right. If you
Probably not a conscious one. She probably convinced herself that she never had.
But if you watch videos of her with the sound off, you can tell when she lies. Her body language and her micro expressions give it away. She was such an expressive face. It might only be 2 frames, but it's enough for someone who's watching. If you listen to her without watching the video, with your eyes closed, and mark the time, you'll find that matches what you see. And there's always a disconnect between what she says and what her face is saying.
Well, I think the thing with
John Key was a stone cold killer. right? He could lie like a flatfish
A smiling
and
assassin.
smile
Yes.
at you while he was doing it, right? Shameless politician he was, immense skill who actually achieved nothing. Helen Clark, I rate her as one of our best prime ministers.
Yeah.
She stared down a couple of coup attempts. She corralled and managed a fractious caucus. I didn't agree with her politics. I didn't agree with some of her totalitarian beliefs that she had. I certainly didn't agree with the Electoral Finance Act. But she was a competent prime minister. And since Helen Clark, I don't think we've had competent prime ministers. And I don't think Christopher Luxon is competent even to be a minister.
I agree with much of what you say about John Key. I think he was an ambitious man who made his money first and then ticked off
He was a coward,
the
though.
rest of his bucket list. But as you say, he was a very, very shrewd politician.
He told me he was going to get the referendum on the flag across the line simply through his ability to convince people, and I just laughed at him when he said that.
Yeah.
That's when I lost all respect for him.
Well, if he had had a flag like Canada's, he would have. But he didn't have a flag like Canada's.
He made a mistake. He stupidly believed that because the Labour Party had it in their manifesto for several elections that they wanted to change the flag, that if he said we want to change the flag, he'd get the Labour Party on board. And I said to him, the moment you announce this, that will be dropped like a hotcake and they'll vociferously oppose it because they want to be the ones to change the flag, not you. And he goes, oh, no, they won't do that. Okay.
All right.
But I remember after Dirty Politics, he rang my father up and he said to Dad, oh, look, can you just pass on a message to Cam? Now, this is a guy who used to ring me all the time. You pass on a message to Cam, no hard feelings. And Dad said to him, ring him yourself and tell him. And he didn't. And it is when I completely lost all respect for the guy. And ever since that time, whenever I've written an article about him, I finish it off by saying, hey, John, no hard feelings. Because I'm still here and he's not.
Yes.
And you're still here.
Yes.
And some of the people that you've had battles with are long gone.
Yeah. Yeah. As on one day will I. We're all mortal.
We are all mortal, but,
Right.
you know, our writing is immortal, though. Well, you haven't had 2 books written about you, though.
No, absolutely not. I've turned out to have had 1 book in me, and I don't think I'll be given the chance to write another.
Well, books are a bit passé now, aren't they?
Well, yes, there's still a lot of people who read, but there are an alarming number of people who don't.
No.
Incredible.
But see, that's where someone like Winston or you or me or Barry Soper, we read vociferously. We watch everything. We see everything. And that's why we can comment on these things and we sound like a bunch of old grumpy white men sitting here talking. But you know what? We're not often wrong.
Often wrong. No, I wouldn't say I was often wrong. I have been wrong, however.
I've been wrong, once or twice. I've corrected that, though.
Well, it always used to dumbfound my journalistic colleagues that I would, if I had made an egregious, mistake or predicted something which did not happen, that I would, write a column or write an article,
Prostrating yourself to your readers that you got something wrong.
not so much prostrating, but just saying, clearly I'm
And let's read that. Well, I've done that. I remember Chris Carter once, I got something horribly wrong about Chris Carter. And, a measure of someone is how they deal with criticism, right? And I'd made I made a mistake. And ironically, it was a mistake based on information that came to me from a national minister, right? So I had no reason to doubt that person. that they'd never lied to me, but it was wrong. Chris Carter rang me up. Cam, you've written this. Yes, Chris. He said, it's wrong. This is what actually happened. I said, oh, thank you for telling me that. I'll correct that now. And ever since then, Chris Carter and I have had a congenial relationship because he didn't get all upset and threaten lawyers or do anything. He just made a phone call. And he found that I was approachable, and I found that I'd made a mistake.
Yeah.
And I think that's how you have to deal with things.
Well, I think that's what so many people are looking for in politicians. Men and women who do not pretend to infallibility and who are capable of acknowledging error and of changing their minds. I think it was Keynes who said, "When the facts change, I change my opinions. What do you do, sir?"
Oh, it was Jesus who said, to change your ways. That's what repent means. It doesn't mean to flip-flop. Repent means to change your mind. And I've often had my mind changed by you, whether you know it or not.
There we are.
And I'd like to think sometimes I've changed your mind.
You have indeed.
Now, I remember, you mentioned Martin Bradbury before. This will be a good little thing to wrap up on. I can remember when he was running that Citizen A show.
Oh, yes.
And I was on almost every week on that. And he'd have a lineup of lefties that he'd get on the show, and he'd say to them, "You're on the show because you need to get Cam." All right, and I know that he said that to you at one point.
Oh, yes. Well, not in as many words,
Not in
but
as many words.
I certainly got the idea.
Yeah. But I made it and I knew this, but I didn't make it a competition or anything else. What I set myself as a little goal when I went on those shows was to say something that someone like you, who was supposed to be opposing me, would say, "Well, actually, Martin, I agree with Cam." And there's quite a few of those.
Yeah.
And that's what I have always enjoyed about discussing things with you. When we do offline chats and things like, it's no holds barred, but we're not trying to kill each other.
No. Well, I've always thought that's the great selling point of democracy, that disagreements, which at other times and in other places have people reaching for their pistols or their machine guns.
Well, I think there's some merit in pistols at dawn. That's a better way to sort out defamation issues. All right.
Possibly.
Anyway, Chris.
But yeah, it's always, what was it? Churchill said, jaw is better than war. Yeah, and talking, it has this amazing ability not only to let you see what another person is, but to hear what they're saying.
Which is why you're one of my guest speakers at my event on July the 5th.
Short but sweet, I hope.
And I am very much looking forward to that event. There's 20 years that I've been writing, blogging, talking, putting myself out there about politics. You've done it a little bit longer than that. But we're all mates at the end of the day, playing a game.
Well, we are part of the great camaraderie of commentary, comrade.
So thanks very much for coming on the Good Oil podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Been my pleasure.
Thank you, Chris.
Hey, now welcome to the show, where the wind's blowing strong and the truth can flow. This is the Good Oil. Catch a vibe today with Cam Slater leading us all the way.